Dr. Thomas Rainwater here with us this morning. So, if you do not know Thomas, he is a research scientist with the Yawkey Wildlife Center and Clemson University's Baruch Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science, both based in Georgetown, South Carolina, there on the coast. Thomas originally hails from Florence, South Carolina. Sorry about that, Thomas.
We'll call
And
it up.
developed an interest in ecology while he was exploring the woods and the swamps near his childhood home. He has a BS in biology, which he completed at Furman University, an MS in environmental toxicology, which he completed here at Clemson University, and a Ph.D. in environmental toxicology from Texas Tech University. And prior to his current appointment here with Clemson in Yawkey Wildlife Center, he had an appointment as a wildlife ecotoxicologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So he has a broad range of experience and expertise. And over the last 30 years of his career, he's studied a wide range of species, mostly reptiles and birds, in several countries, including Central America, Africa, Asia, and of course, throughout the U.S. And since 2010, he's really been a key player and member of a close collaborative team studying the biology of the American alligator on the coastal plain of South Carolina. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that among his many other strengths, Thomas is a really fantastic field biologist, natural historian. He's a wonderful mentor to our graduate students, and he's a great overall collaborator. So one of the big contributions I just want to touch on that he's made to the field lately is serving as the lead organizer for the Palmetto Alligator Symposium. This is a meeting that occurs every 2 years, and it's hosted at Baruch. And Thomas does a really incredible job of recruiting crocodilian experts from across the Alligators range in the southeastern U.S., as well as folks doing amazing work overseas to kind of share their expertise and their ongoing research and conservation efforts. So I think you'll enjoy his talk today, and I will go ahead and turn it over to him. So thank you, Thomas, for being here today. We look forward to hearing what you have to share.
Thank you, Kathy, for that very, very kind introduction. And I'm real happy to be here. I want to thank, again, Kathy, and I'll get to that in just a second, but I know today's the last seminar for the semester. So thanks everybody for tuning in to the last one. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this series. So at the beginning, I'd like to kind of acknowledge all of our partners and our collaborators. I won't go through all these individually, of course, but the point of this slide is just to kind of let you all know that what you probably already know is that the things I'll talk about today are not something that I've done alone, of course. This is, as Kathy mentioned, a collaboration through a lot of different groups, people, faculty, agencies. It's just a big group of collaborators and partners. I want to thank all of them collectively. And then again, I want to thank you all for being here today. Letting me be part of the seminar series. I want to thank Kathy for inviting me. I want to thank Erica and Thea and I think Jessica for making just all the technical aspects of everything, getting this organized. And I've watched several of the talks this semester and really enjoyed it. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this. And also want to thank the students. So that you know, as I get older, up in age and my career, so forth. You know, it started off, it was all about, you know, the animals and doing all this cool research, and it still is for sure. But what I've learned over the years, it's really rewarding to work with students. And, you know, it seems like just yesterday I was one myself, but I still feel like one sometimes. But it's really, really rewarding to work with these young minds and the energy, enthusiasm, and the promise these people show. And so, again, today I'll talk about a lot of projects, but most of these projects have been conducted by or with students. So I want to thank them. And even during COVID, when things looked kind of bleak when it came to wildlife research, or not wildlife research, but, you know, classes and indoor type activities, lab work and so forth, we still were able to get a lot done in the field because the students were still able to get outside. And so we were still pretty productive. And so I want to thank them for that as well. And also I'd like to kind of mention and thank some pioneers and mentors. On the top left, you've got Tom Murphy, Mark Barra, and Phil Wilkinson. These guys were all alligator biologists for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources back in the 60s and 70s. They're all retired now, but Tom and Phil still do alligator research in South Carolina. But all three of them were very, very busy and involved in alligator research back in the 60s and 70s when the animals were federally listed. And they laid the groundwork for what we do today. All the research they did back in those days, especially Phil and Tom, who caught alligators all across the state and tagged them, marked them. And we're still today capturing animals they marked, 30, 40 years ago, and getting incredible information on growth and other aspects of their life history because of this long-term data set. So I've worked with both of them, and actually all three of them for many years, and I've learned a lot. And then on the bottom right, Lou Gillette. If you never knew Lou or heard of Lou, I urge you to look him up. But he was an extremely well-known wildlife or endocrinologist, reproductive endocrinologist, crocodilian biologist. Did incredible science, but he was even a more incredible mentor in person. I'll get to him a little bit later, but he moved to South Carolina in 2010. I worked with him for quite a number of years, and he had a major impact on my life and my career, as well as some of these other folks. So just wanted to mention them and acknowledge them, and they'll come up again in my presentation a little bit later. Now, a little bit about me. Kathy gave me a very warm, a kind introduction, more than I certainly deserve. But just to say that, it wasn't more than about 25 years ago, I started my career as a wildlife biologist or crocodilian biologist at Clemson. I was a student back in the mid-90s. And since that time, I've been very fortunate. I've been able to work on crocodilians, a lot of different places, a lot of different species. Kathy mentioned some of those. And again, this isn't a slide to say, oh, look what I did. It's more to show that I've been very fortunate. And as I mentioned, getting older in years and appreciating things, I've learned that over time that I appreciate the people more than I do really the work. I read my journal sometimes that from the old days, and again, not really old days, but 25, 30 years ago. And I noticed that most of my writings are about the people I've been working with, as opposed to the adventures that we've been experiencing. So it's a combination of everything, but yeah, I think you'll all learn over time that some of the richest part of this type of career is the people you work with. But anyway, I came full circle, and here I am back at Clemson again, which is fantastic. Kathy mentioned I grew up in the coastal plain of South Carolina, and I'm back working here for Clemson. My job is a kind of an unusual position. It's a dual appointment. So I work for Clemson, but also work for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. And my office is located at the building shown here. This is the Baruch Institute down in Georgetown, South Carolina. If you haven't been there, we hope we get you there sometime. It's a beautiful facility and a lot of really prime property to do research. And then just south of us, here's a kind of a map to kind of give you some context. But of course, there's Clemson up here to the left where you guys are. And then down here in Georgetown, South Carolina is where the Baruch Institute is. And then just a few miles south of that is the Yawkey Wildlife Center, where we do most of our research on alligators. Not all, we do a lot of work throughout the coast of South Carolina, as we may get to a little bit later, but the Yawkey Wildlife Center is kind of the nucleus of most of what we do. Here's a map of the Yawkey Center, just this area here in green, not this stuff down here, just this part here. The Yawkey Center is about a 24,000 acre wildlife preserve that was willed to the state of South Carolina by Tom Yawkey when he died in 1976. And he left it to the state to be used as a waterfowl wildlife preserve, and also to be used as for an educational research reserve. And it's got a really unique set of habitats. It's managed for waterfowl and wildlife. So there's a lot of impounded wetlands, managed wetlands, but also a lot of marsh, maritime forest, longleaf pine, beach habitat. So it's very diverse, very, 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 very neat place. And two things about this property that make it pretty unique from a wildlife perspective, and also from an alligator perspective, is that first, it's has not been hunted on for over 100 years. So the animals there are in a pretty pristine state, aside from the management activities that go on there. So it's still pretty pristine. Secondly, from an alligator perspective, I'll show you a map in a minute, but the property itself and its location on the coast is close to the alligator's northern distributional limit in its range. You'll see a map in a minute of the alligator's range. So we're able to study things up here in South Carolina that may be very different than you would see in alligators in Florida and Louisiana and those parts of the range as well. But probably the most important part of Yawkey, what makes it so unique from an alligator perspective, is the long-term data set that I mentioned before. And again, this is Phil Wilkinson. And back in the late 70s, he began to capture alligators for research purposes, tag them, release them. He got growth rate information on them, a variety of projects. But he maintained that work for 30 years until, I guess, the late 90s when he retired. But he lives 20 minutes away from this site and still comes over there quite a bit. And when I moved back to South Carolina in 2010, I volunteered with Phil and began to work with him on this project. And this long-term data set It's amazing. We're still seeing animals and capturing animals on this property that he tagged as adults back in the late 70s, early 80s. These animals are in their 70s now, probably. And really nowhere else in the world do you find anyone or any place, whether it's Australia, Africa, India, South America, you name it, where the animals, individual animals, have been followed for this long a period of time. So it opens up the door to us to look at really unique aspects of the natural history in terms of how age influences different parameters. So it's really unusual. We're trying to capitalize on that. So add to that, Lou Gillette moved here, as I mentioned, in 2010. He'd been at the University of Florida for almost 30 years of his career, and he made a name for himself as a reproductive endocrinologist and alligator biologist. But he moved to South Carolina in 2010 to get with a dual appointment at the medical university and the marine lab there. And I knew Lou and both Phil from years past, and we were able to get those two guys together. And with Phil's long-term data set and this Yawkey, this wildlife setting, and this great research site, and then Lou's background and his army of students and technology and laboratory capabilities, we put together a nice collaboration that continues to this day. Now, sadly, we lost Lou in 2015 to lymphoma after an 8-year battle, but he left a legacy that continues to this day with his students and the research. So with all that, I'm going to kind of give you an idea of what we do at Yawkey and across the coastal plain with alligators. And it's kind of a three-pronged approach. It's very broad, very general, but if you think about stressors, you can take any animal you can think of, choose your favorite animal, pandas or alligator crocodiles or, eagles or, beluga whales or whatever. These 6 stressors are pretty much the top 6 things that are threatening wildlife in the world today. And so we try to focus on one or more of these stressors and how they influence crocodilian populations, in this case, alligators. I've been doing this type of work for quite a while, but alligators have been the focus in South Carolina, of course. But so stressors are kind of the main focus, but also baseline studies. And as Lou Gillette would often say, you can't understand abnormal until you first understand normal. In other words, if we want to understand how environmental pollutants affect alligator biology or alligator reproduction, we first need to understand how alligators behave normally, how they reproduce normally in the absence of stressors. So the collection of just baseline information on growth, on reproduction, on diet, on movement, all these things are so important to allow us to compare these trends over time from baseline levels to then levels influenced by stressors. So stressors, baseline studies, and then at the very end, we've got the long-term monitoring that we try to do this for a long period of time. And as we've learned, and many of you probably learned in your own studies, long-term data sets are really invaluable. There's so much you can learn. You can sometimes make incorrect inferences on things if you only have 1 year data. I mean, I can tell you just from experience at Yawkey, that we may have seen something, a phenomenon or something that seemed like a trend, and then we wait 3 or 4 years, and what we thought was happening wasn't. It was just a kind of an outlier. So the longer term data you can get, the better off you are. At least that's what we've learned, at least. So all that to say, our research at Yawkey is kind of a melting pot of descriptive studies where we kind of just monitor things as they go, experimental studies where we take eggs out of the field sometimes, incubate them to look at effects of incubation temperature on hatching, let's say, or contaminants, things like that. And then also fortuitous discoveries. Some of the most interesting findings in science, including what we've done at Yawkey, have all occurred based on just total luck. We just kind of stumble upon something we didn't expect, and ends up being a really interesting finding. So what we do at Yawkey kind of covers all 3 of those. So what I'm going to do now is kind of give you some background information on alligators. Just a lot of this you probably already know, but just kind of bring everybody up to speed on alligators in general, provide some context. Then I'll go into some of the research we do kind of on an annual basis, kind of what we do, kind of our bread and butter every summer, what we do to study alligators, and then go into some of the results of some of our studies and just kind of give you a taste of what we've done so far and things that can be done in the future. So as I mentioned, alligators are southeastern species. They range from central Texas across the south all the way into the Carolinas. You'll see here's the South Carolina coast and the North Carolina coast. And as you get into North Carolina toward Virginia, they begin to peter out. And so again, up here in Yawkey in this area is pretty much the northern distributional limit of alligators. And so we can learn things about how growth rates and things may be different up here, where we have cooler winters and shorter summers by just maybe just a couple of weeks. But to us, that's nothing. To gators, it could be a big deal, as opposed to South Florida and South Texas, things like that. Again, some basic biology information. Alligators, of course, are semi-terrestrial, well, they're aquatic predators, but they're semi-terrestrial and they're ectotherms, right? They can't produce their own internal body heat, so they must use their behavior to regulate their body heat. So if they need to cool down, they need to move into warmer areas. They need to get warmer, they have to move into warmer areas. As far as size goes, everybody wants to know how big alligators get. There's some unofficial records of alligators that have reached lengths of 19 feet. Those are not official, so they're not really accepted. You might be surprised to find that the official record length of an alligator in the U.S. is 14 feet 9.5 inches, which is still a really big alligator. It's not anything to sniff at, but it's still not, if you're approaching 19 feet, that's a much bigger animal. But in South Carolina, I've never seen anything over 13.5 feet. So anything 12 foot, 11 or 12 feet is a really big alligator in South Carolina. They start off as about 10 inches at birth, and they grow to be quite large. So it's quite a bit of a difference from birth to adulthood. Now, diet, as you might guess, alligators are opportunistic, generalist predators. They'll eat pretty much anything. There is ontogenetic differences in diet. Hatchlings, of course, this all has to do with gape limitation. So how big the animal can open its mouth and swallow things. So hatchlings, when they're really small, 10 inches in length, they feed on little things like minnows and spiders and insects and other invertebrates, things like that. And as they get larger, they take larger prey. And a large adult alligator could take, a full-grown white-tailed deer with no problem. But often what happens is alligators, even large alligators, tend to take lots of small prey as opposed to, occasional large prey. So, but again, the take-home message here is they eat pretty much everything. So usually about late March or mid-April, alligators begin their courtship, and they have a really elaborate courtship behavior for reptiles. And so if you ever had the chance to hear an alligator bellow, the bellowing of an alligator, it sounds like a jet engine starting. You can actually feel it if you're close by. It's unbelievable. But these males will raise their heads and their tails out of the water and begin to bellow, and that causes these vibrations, and the water dances off the back of the alligator, and it's pretty amazing. But alligators have this unique set of behaviors during the courtship. The males and females do head rubbing, and there's a variety of vocalizations and jaw clapping, and it's really hard to see this in the wild. I've seen very little of it myself, but most of what we know about courtship has been observed in captivity. But it's quite involved. And in alligators, the females and males get together and they mate in deeper water. And once copulation is completed, the males tend to swim off and they stay in kind of more open areas where females tend to look for nesting habitat. And about 2 to 3 weeks post copulation, the female will begin looking for a place to build a nest. And so alligators build nests out of vegetation. Some crocodilians, about a third of the species, will build whole nests. So they'll, like sea turtles, go and find a flat beach somewhere on the edge of a river or a stream, dig a hole with their back feet, drop the eggs in, cover the nest up, and it's flat, like a sea turtle nest. You would never know the alligator nest was there. But most species, including alligators, build mound nests, mounds of vegetation. So she finds a spot near the water, but slightly elevated, so it can withstand a little bit of flooding. And then she'll, with her tail and her head and her limbs, she'll knock down the vegetation near at the nest site and heap it up into this big mound. And she'll use her tail and her head to kind of climb on top of it and shape it into this big igloo type sized nest. And she'll pat it down, and it can be as large as about almost 9 feet wide and almost 4.5 feet tall. And when she's ready, she'll climb on top of the nest, usually at night. And then with her back legs, she'll come to the top of the nest about right here. She'll move over to about right here and dig a hole with her back legs, and she'll deposit the entire clutch. It may take a couple hours to do that. She'll deposit the entire clutch in the nest and then cover it up with her legs. And the nest remains closed the entire incubation period, which takes about 9 weeks, which is about 65 days, almost to the day. So the nest is covered up and closed. The female is nearby and she tends the nest. We'll get to that a little bit later, but she's not there all the time. She doesn't sit on the nest like a bird would. She's nearby. And something about alligators and crocodilians is pretty unique, is they have what's called temperature-dependent sex determination. In other words, there aren't sex chromosomes that determine the sex of the hatchlings. Instead, it's determined by temperature. It hasn't been figured out yet how it works. We're pretty close. We know it involves temperature, hormones, genes, but they're getting closer. But we know that there's a certain time period during that 9-week incubation period where sex is determined by temperature. There's some other animals that have this too, but crocodilians all have it. here's a picture of a nest with the eggs exposed, just to show you what it looks like. There's the eggs, the clutch of eggs. The eggs are kind of like chicken eggs. They're hard-shelled eggs. They're a little bit larger and a little bit longer than chicken eggs. But they're about 10 inches down into the nest, and they remain there for the incubation period unless they happen to be predated by predators. The female again will stay with the nest when she can to protect it. But even so, predators often get the eggs, and this is the number one predator of alligator nests in South Carolina, the raccoon. Other parts of the range, other predators will take eggs, including like in Texas and Louisiana, wild pigs are major predators. In Georgia and Florida, black bears will take eggs, and even invasive species like these tegu lizards. There's these monitor lizards that are now invasive, moving their way up from Florida into South Carolina now. They take alligator eggs as well. But in South Carolina, the raccoons are the number one predator. And I would say, at least at Yawkey, we think at least a third to a half of the eggs or nests built every year are taken by alligators. The eggs are predated. And so it's not a minor thing. They take quite a bit of the eggs. But if things go well and the female can keep the predators away, this is what you end up with. You end up with a clutch of eggs about to hatch. And before the eggs do hatch, the individual embryos are inside the eggshell, and they vocalize within the egg, and it sounds like this. Sounds kind of like that. And what that does is that signals the female that it's time for her to come and liberate the egg, the hatchlings from the nest material. And so we have a lot of photographs of this over the last few years at Yawkey, but the female comes to the nest, she'll lay her chin, her jaw on the nest, and sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for hours. And we're just kind of speculating here. We think that she just somehow either listens to the young or feels vibrations or something, but she decides it's time. And then she begins to open the nest up with her forelimbs and with her snout. She keeps digging deeper into the nest. And then finally, when she reaches the clutch, very gently with these jaws that are strong enough they're extremely powerful jaws, as you know, she can pick up delicately each individual hatchling with these jaws, turn around and carry them to the water to safety. Because just like sea turtles, again, the journey from the nest to the water may only be a few meters, can be pretty perilous for these animals. This is the one time in life when alligators are very vulnerable to predation. So there's 25 or more documented predators of alligators, and most of them are in South Carolina, and they're watching. And so the female will carry each individual alligator to the water. It may take her 2 hours to do this, but she'll do that and then try to stay with the alligator, the babies, up to a year, and sometimes a year and a half. But even so, not many make it. I would say maybe, and this is kind of a guesstimation, talking to other biologists, but they think maybe, a given nest, 10% of the babies make it the first year, and probably 1% make it to adulthood. So this is a juvenile, hatchling alligator. The beautiful coloration we think is cryptic coloration to provide camouflage from predators. You look at this white or yellow bands going across the alligator's back. We think there's maybe mimic sunlight kind of shining through the tall vegetation and the marsh grass, and like shadows and sunlight. But very good camouflage for these babies as they try to survive the first year of life. And as they get older, these bands begin to fade. But even so, as I mentioned, there's not many of them that make it. And so this is a great blue heron feeding on a hatching alligator. And this is not uncommon. People have seen one heron take an entire clutch of alligators in one afternoon. It's pretty common. Other animals like bobcats, raccoons, other alligators, snakes, turtles, fish, bullfrogs, all take alligators. So not many of them make it the first year. So I get this question often. I give talks to the public and to different people about alligators. As you know, for me to have this as a study system is pretty easy because everybody loves alligators. It's pretty easy the alligators, garner a lot of attention. It has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the species, I guess. If I was studying blood flukes, nothing against blood flukes, but it's just, alligators seem to get people's attention. So we do a lot of talks to people and, why do you study alligators? What good are they? And I talk about the cultural and aesthetic values of alligators. And I talk about the economic values of alligators when it comes to hunting or the skin trade, things like that. But I don't often get to talk about the ecological parts of alligators that make them so valuable. So today I want to mention some of those things. So there's four main kind of ecological values of alligators that we talk about. Most of these aren't fully quantified, but we think these are going on. But for alligators, of all the species of crocodilian in the world, we have the most data for alligators, but these next four values are kind of crocodilians in general. The first is that alligators and crocodilians in general are apex predators that we talked about. They're top of the food chain. They feed on everything below them, and they feed on invertebrates. They feed on vertebrates. They feed on all sizes of different prey. And by doing so, we think that they are, in some ways regulating the populations of prey species. And to a bigger degree, and this hasn't been quantified, but people think that alligators actually, by doing so, this kind of has cascading effects on the structure and function of the ecosystems where they live. And so they think that's one of the services they provide. Secondly, you may have heard this term, ecosystem engineers. Alligators and crocodilians in general actually create and maintain certain structures in the environment just through their natural history. One of those is, look in the background here. This is this little pond here. That's an example of a gator hole or a wallow or a pool. And alligators, they kind of shape out these little depressions in the marsh or in the ground. And these little ponds or pools retain rainwater, fresh water during times of drought, and also provide other functions as well. So you have these pools, and you also have these. They also burrow in the banks of rivers and ponds and streams. And these burrows or these dens also collect fresh water. So collectively, these wallows and these dens provide shelter to alligators and other wildlife as well during periods of severe weather, cold or heat. They provide fresh water when other areas of fresh water are dried up, and they also provide access to prey. Prey species sometimes spend time in these areas, and alligators and other animals can access them. Number two is the nests. See all these nests in the background. There's nests all over the landscape back here. Here's another couple of nests, and we know that from studies over the years that other animals use these nests for a variety of purposes. So in this schematic, there's snakes, turtles, and lizards. We know they use alligator nests to nest in themselves. And at Yawkey, just for example, we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years a variety of birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles that use these nests for basking, for feeding, for nesting, a variety of different functions. So we don't know yet what all the uses are. We just know that other animals use these nests. So these are just examples of them, the ecosystem engineers. The third value is this. What this basically means is nutrient transfer in a short description. So on the left panel there, you see that, and this is mostly for coastal animals, like animals in South Carolina and Louisiana, South Florida, where you have animals that spend a lot of time in fresh water, but then they also move through brackish systems into the marine habitats, and they go back and forth a lot. This connects these two systems. And what it's actually doing is alligators are taking nutrients from freshwater systems and excreting them into these marine systems, and vice versa, taking food from the marine systems back into the freshwater systems and the brackish systems and excreting waste there. So it's nutrient transfer. And the same thing goes for the right panel. Again, this is for crocodilians in general, but throughout every life stage of alligators and other crocodilians, they're preyed upon by terrestrial predators. Hatchlings, even adult alligators and crocs are preyed on by large cats. And so you get this transfer of aquatic nutrients into the terrestrial system. And likewise, alligators and crocodiles feed on terrestrial species. So those terrestrial nutrients are transferred into the aquatic system. So again, nutrient transfer. This is a fruitful area for study. It'd be hard to do this, but we want to try to get a handle on this and quantify this nutrient transfer. And then last, the fourth value of alligators is as ecological indicators. And there's kind of 2 points here. The first is, you think about how researchers often look at wildlife, in this case, alligator reproductive status, abundance, health, as kind of an indicator of how their management activities are affecting the ecosystem. An example of this is how alligators and crocodiles in the Everglades are used to assess the impacts of restoration efforts on the Everglades. So that's been going on for decades. Now, other animals are used as well, birds and fish, but alligators and crocodiles are two of the main species they use to monitor the effects of those efforts. And then number two, and the main one here, is you look at all these cartoons. These are all sources of environmental contamination in the environment. So you've got industrial sources of metals and of perfluorinated compounds. You've got agriculture with fertilizers and nitrogen and phosphorus, and you've got pesticides, DDTs, and so forth, all getting into these aquatic systems. And because alligators have a very broad diet, they've got a very long lifespan, and comparatively speaking, they have pretty small home ranges, or they have a lot of site fidelity. They're really good indicators of environmental contamination in localized areas. And so they've been used as such for many years. Again, other animals can be used too, but alligators and crocodiles have been very successfully used. In fact, Lou Gillette's entire career, his late career, was based upon that premise. and he's the one that pretty much brought it to light. He studied the effects of environmental contaminants on the endocrine system of alligators and other abnormalities in terms of reproduction of alligators in Florida. And so again, those are the kind of the four main ways alligators are kind of useful in the services they provide ecologically. So now let's talk about some of the things that we've been doing over the last several years. So at least for me, the last 10, 11 years, we've been doing this research at Yawkey and throughout the South Carolina, but Yawkey's kind of our main study site. And it all kind of centers around nest surveys. And so every June, early June, the females begin looking for a nest site. And so we began looking for alligator nests in probably mid to late June. And we use helicopters because they're a lot easier to find. Alligator nests, or, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, really. Mark Barra used to try to find alligator nests in South Carolina using boats and canoes. And then one day Phil went up in a helicopter and he found more nests in one day than Mark had found in 5 years. And so they said, okay, it's worth the money. Let's pay the helicopter pilot. And so they've been doing that ever since. And so we go out, we fly at least 3 times, 3 weeks in a row in June to look for alligator nests. Here's a photograph of Phil looking for nests from above. And again, you can probably imagine it's hard to find them from above, but even harder to find from the ground. But this is what we're looking for. So this photograph shows at the top, this is it's almost like an alien crop circle. Imagine this being a cornfield in Iowa and this big opening. You can see it's very obvious. And so this opening in the marsh with this mound in the middle, there's the alligator nest. And if you look closely, you see this nice little trail leading to a guard hole. There's the female's guard hole, and there she is facing to the left. And so from the helicopter, we look for this opening in the marsh and hopefully a guard hole or a trail associated with it. And then we hover above the nest. There's the female guarding in the nest, even the helicopter's blowing over her. We hover above the nest, and then we look for, we get a GPS coordinate over the nest. And after about 3 hours of flying over the property, all the areas have been covered. We come back down, hop in a truck, drive out to the property, to the areas, pull the GPS out, say, okay, the nest is 200 yards that way. With a machete off, we go into the nest until we find, to the marsh until we find the nest. Once the nest is found and the female is safely away, we open the nest carefully and look for the eggs. And so if there are eggs in the nest, then we actually pull them out carefully. We count them. Sometimes we'll measure them and then put them back in the nest. Or in some cases, we'll pull them out, or a subset of the eggs, and take them into the laboratory for a variety of different incubation studies, which we do mostly with the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory and Ben Parrott's lab. It used to be Lou Gillette's lab, but Ben has taken over that work in the last 5 or 6 years. So that's most of the nest work. And so then we actually, we also put temperature data loggers in the nest to record temperature of the nest during the incubation period to get an idea of incubation temperatures and sex ratios. And then aside from that, we also do a lot of trapping and capturing of alligators. I mentioned to you that Phil and his team would catch alligators back in the 70s and 80s, tag them and release them. And we do the same thing and try to make sure as many alligators as possible on the study site have been tagged and marked. Here's just some shots of us trapping alligators. And we also do some active captures with fishing rods and other tools. And the idea behind this is to catch as many alligators, especially adults, as we can over time, mark them and tag them, measure them, so that over the next 10 to 15, even when I'm long gone, these alligators will still be here and people can actually look at growth rates and a variety of other endpoints. And lastly, we get body measurements, of course, total length, probably 5 or 6 different measurements. We determine the sex of the individuals. We mark them or tag them in 3 different ways. We look them over for abnormalities and any injuries, and then we get a blood sample. And the blood samples are used for a variety of things, including genetics, contaminant studies, endocrine studies, immunology, stable isotopes for things like biomagnification studies with contaminants or diet studies, and then just general health panels. We use the blood for blood chemistry results. So a lot of work done with the blood samples. So finally, what are we finding? What have we found over the last 10 years or so? We've had some studies, we've completed some, we're still just getting started on, but so some of the basic information we've gathered over the last 10 years of doing nest work is that the average clutch size of an alligator, at Yawkey at least, is 44 eggs. We've seen as many as 60 eggs in a nest, but 44 is the average. We've seen even down in the teens, but most eggs have around 44. Most nests have about 44 eggs. We did a study a few years ago with a master's student named Josh Zadell from the University of Georgia, looking at multiple paternity, which is just the occurrence of multiple males siring a nest. In other words, females will mate with multiple males. And that had been done twice before only, and that was in Louisiana back in the 90s. Never been done in South Carolina before, but we got blood samples from all of our adults and also from and got genetic samples from our eggs. And we looked at multiple paternity and found that indeed, this wasn't a big surprise that multiple paternity was happening at Yawkey, but we found that about 47% of the nest had multiple fathers. So for a given clutch of eggs like this one in this picture, there may be up to 3 fathers souring that clutch. And we think what's going on is that the female will breed with a couple of large adult, kind of dominant males. And so the cool thing about this study is not only can we tell you that this nest had 3 fathers, we can probably tell you who the 3 fathers were. We probably tell you how big they were because we've caught most of these animals before. So it's really pretty cool. So we found out that there's probably 4 or 5 dominant males at Yawkey, and they sire most of the clutches there. But then after they breed, at some point, some other males get in and they breed with her as well. And so there's actually sometimes more than one father that sire these clutches. And one of the interesting things we found was that if you compare clutches sired by one father versus clutches sired by multiple fathers, the clutches with one father were more fertile for some reason. We don't really know why. That's something for further study, but it was one of the interesting things we found. But we found it takes, on average, males 12 years to reach sexual maturity. That doesn't mean they're going to reproduce at the age of 12, because there's larger dominant males that kind of push them away, but they're physiologically capable of reproducing. They just often get pushed away. And then females, 16 years to reach reproductive age. So delayed sexual maturity. And that's one of the reasons we worry sometimes about hunting seasons. Everybody wants to catch or kill the trophy animal, the really big animals, right? And so over time, if you take away too many big animals from the population, there may be a situation where they can't replace themselves. You may see a population influence on that. So we keep an eye on that. But again, delayed sexual maturity, similar to turtles. Once a female reaches sexual maturity, we think she can we know actually for a fact, she can nest, at least at Yawkey, for almost 50 years after that. And I'll tell you in a minute, I'll show you something about that, but it's pretty amazing. And we think that the animals can live probably, into their 70s and probably into their 80s as well. Now, another kind of, this is one of those examples of kind of just stumbling upon something. We were doing all this alligator capture work and measuring animals, and we caught a bunch of animals that Phil had caught in the past and didn't think much of it. This is really cool. We caught this animal, 30 years ago, says Phil, and we measured it, and that was pretty interesting. But then if you think back about the patterns of growth in invertebrates, there's 2 patterns. There's determinate growth and there's indeterminate growth. Determinate growth is that growth pattern that we exhibit, mammals exhibit, where we grow to a certain height or length, and then we stop growing. Some people grow to be 4 feet tall and 5 feet tall and 6 feet tall, whatever. And then we stop, and then we live for many, many more years without growing any taller. We get a little bit wider sometimes, but we don't get much taller or taller at all. As opposed to indeterminate growth, where some animals will grow throughout their entire lifetime. Certain fish, mollusks, and some reptiles can grow throughout their lifetimes. And as I grew up as a child, and many of you, I should probably the same way, I learned from readings and watching documentaries and things that alligators and crocodilians exhibited indeterminate growth. They grew until they died. And that's been the dogma. You can look in the literature, it's still there, that they tend to grow until they die. And I think part of that's because no one actually followed individual animals throughout their lifetime long enough, because they live as long as we do probably, and it's hard to follow the same individuals. But back to Phil, back in 1981, he called this female, he called her Bertha, because at the time she was the largest, she was Big Bertha, the largest female ever captured. At that point, she was 9'7", which is big for a female. He called her at a nest and put a transmitter on her to track her. And at that time, she was 9'7", which is about 293 centimeters in length, and let her go, and off she went. Well, then I came to work with Phil, and in 2011, 2010, we caught her again. And she was the same length, basically 292 centimeters. And 3 more times over time, we caught her, and she still had not grown at all. So we began to look at some of the old data from animals that Phil had caught back in the 70s and the 80s. And we found that over 30 animals had not shown any growth from 5 years to over 35 years. And that was an amazing finding. And again, we published a paper on that in 2016, pretty much concluding that alligators, at least at Yawkey, we think this is probably crocodilian wide, exhibit determinate growth. In other words, they stop growing at a certain age. And that was kind of a new thing. And again, we think it shouldn't be that surprising. It's just no one's followed these animals throughout their lifetimes as long as Phil has. Again, this is all about Phil. And about 5 years prior to that, this is Holly Ballard. Her name was Holly Woodward at the time, but she'd published a paper in Journal of Herpetology where she had independently determined also that alligators had determinate growth. But she used a different method, a laboratory method. She's a paleontologist, and she collected the long bones, the humerus and the femurs from alligators that died in captivity. And she analyzed them for what's called an EFS, or extra fundamental system. And all that is, at least to me, looking at these photographs, you see these layers of this kind of these bone microstructures, but they look like layers of bone on the very outer cortex of these long bones. So they take a long bone like a femur or humerus, do a cross section, she stains it, and she looks for these microstructures called the EFS. And if they're present, that indicates that animal had stopped growing, the bones had stopped growing in both circumference and girth. So it's an indicator of the growth has stopped. And she found that in these adult alligators, in these captive animals. And so independently, she showed that in the laboratory, and then we showed it for long-term recaptures about 5 years later. Well, about 2017, we got a chance to kind of join forces with Holly to try to confirm determinate growth in the same animal using two different methods, both field and laboratory methods. And so we found this alligator that we caught several times over the years. He looked really good in 13 and 15, but in 17, Jamie Dozier, our manager at Yawkey, called and said that this gator was in the road. It wasn't looking very good. And after a couple of months, it actually died right in front of us. And so you don't often get to find animals that die of old age. We think of old age in front of you, but we did. And we got all these measurements on the animal. But more importantly, we got the bones. We got the long bones from this animal and sent them to Holly. So she had the humerus and the femur. She analyzed them. Lo and behold, she found the EFS in both the femur of the animal and in the humerus. So this is the animal from Yawkey that we confirmed, at least we confirmed in the field from long-term recaptures showing that it had not grown, but also she confirmed it in the laboratory as well. So this was a paper we published this year on that finding. This is the first time in any crocodilian that they've been able to determine determinate growth by both lab methods and field methods. So it's pretty cool. So the idea is that down the road, if people have in their study systems and around the world, any species, if you have a large animal, especially that's been measured in the past, if it dies, measure it again and send the bones to Holly, she can actually confirm determinate growth. So it's a pretty neat collaboration. And then one more quick thing about Bertha. So this past summer, Randeep and I were working on some work at Yawkey, and we found a nest near where Bertha used to nest. We haven't found a nest from Bertha in over 10 years, or actually this year was 10 years. And we found a nest. Oh, wow, could be Bertha, could be Bertha. So we got pretty excited about it. And so we actually collected the eggs from that nest for some incubation studies, but we kept coming to the nest and we put traps out. In late incubation period, when hatching would have occurred, we caught a gator. Randeep called me up on a Sunday morning. We came flying up to Yawkey, went out there, pulled the gator out of the water, and lo and behold, it was Bertha. And so two cool things about that. First of all, we measured her, and she had not grown at all. So she weighed her length was 289. She showed no growth. Some more data to support determinate growth. But also the cool part was that she nested again. So this is she was estimated to be 68 years old 10 years ago. So we think she's almost 78 this year. She nested. Her eggs were, I think she had a clutch of like 38 eggs, which is a pretty close to the average. And the eggs were, I think the fertility was 89%, which is pretty good. And they hatched the eggs out in captivity, and they told us the hatchlings were really large. So she's still producing nice clutches of fertile eggs at the age of 78, which no one knows anything about this age of reproduction. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, switching gears again to contaminants now. This is kind of my background, environmental toxicology, as Kathy mentioned, but over the years, we've been doing a lot of baseline measuring of contaminants in alligators. And we found, I won't go through all these individually, but we found a lot of metals, organic contaminants like DDTs and PCBs, things like that. And these newer chemicals, these perfluorinated chemicals that you find in nonstick pans and other home products, and also in firefighting foams. They're very common in the environment. We found these chemicals in alligators throughout South Carolina and other parts of the Southeast as well. But we published on that. But mercury was one that we were pretty interested in, because in the lower part of the state, all the rivers in South Carolina, in coastal South Carolina, have fish advisories for mercury. The mercury is pretty high in this part of the state. We think it's naturally occurring. It's been that way for a long time, but there's concerns about consumption of fish by people, and people do eat alligator every now and then. So it's a concern there as well. So we looked at mercury in alligators, and some of the things we found, we want to look at bioaccumulation. One of these studies by Fran Nilsson, she now graduated with a PhD and she works for EPA in the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, but she looked at accumulation of mercury in alligators and potential maternal transfer. So the idea is that mercury gets in the environment either through natural causes or natural sources, or atmospheric deposition from coal-fired power plants is one of those close to Yawkey actually, and it gets into the environment. This alligator laying on this nest is probably she's probably in her 40s or 50s. She's a good sized female, so she's been in the environment for a long time. And had a lot of time to consume contaminated prey over her lifetime and accumulate mercury. And then the idea is that these alligators that consume these chemicals will actually, as the females produce eggs, these chemicals are mobilized from the body tissues into the eggs themselves, and then they expose the embryos to these chemicals. And we're curious about how this influences the fitness of the hatchling. The other question is nest material. So we know that mercury gets into the environment, gets into the plant material, and with other chemicals like DDTs and organics, there've been lab studies where they've put eggs into a testing chamber, and they've dosed the nest material with DDT or other chemicals like that. And DDT is able to go across the eggshell membrane into the embryo, but no one's looked at that before with mercury. And so the idea was, do you see maternal transfer of mercury into these embryos? And do you see nest transfer of mercury from the nest material into the egg? So for we took blood samples from females captured at the nest and also eggs found at the nest, analyzed them for mercury. And we also took nest material from the nest and analyzed those for mercury. And what we found was that, of course, all three contain mercury, the female blood, the eggs, and the nest material, but there was no relationship between nest material mercury and the mercury in the eggs, but there was a pretty strong relationship between the blood concentrations of mercury and those in the eggs of her own eggs, which seems to indicate that the presence of mercury in the eggs is pretty much all from the female. And she also did a lab study to look at transfer of mercury through the eggshell. She actually took the eggs and painted mercury onto the eggshell. In her study, mercury did not cross the barrier. So we think the majority of, probably all the mercury in eggs in the field comes from the female. And then Abby Lawson, a few years ago, she graduated with a PhD from FEC. She did a variety of projects with alligators in coastal South Carolina, but one of the projects was mercury related, where she actually took blood samples that we collected over many years from Yawkey and then she estimated the age of the animals that the blood came from and looked at how age influences mercury exposure. And the way you would probably think about this is that, as I mentioned with the last slide, is a hatchling's born and entered into the system. It's been there for a couple of days, probably very little mercury exposure. But as it grows over time, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 70 years, there's a lot of time to accumulate mercury over a lifetime. And so the idea is what you expect to see is to see kind of a positive relationship between the length of an animal or the age of an animal and the mercury concentration. In other words, the older the animal gets, the higher the mercury concentration. That seems to make sense. That's not what she found. What she found was that the highest concentrations were in these middle-aged animals and low concentrations in the young ones, which makes sense. But the lower concentrations in the higher animals was a surprise to us. We thought we were going to get this linear relationship, but we didn't get that. And one thing we saw was that, again, this is what we expected to see, is that the concentrations of mercury in the females, which is this red line here, was lower than that of the males. And we think what's going on there is that just the females, when they lay eggs, they're basically offloading mercury into the environment. So they're reducing their load. So their loads aren't usually as high as those of the males that don't lay eggs. But it was interesting to see that this concentration of the middle-aged animals was higher than the others. We don't really know what's going on there. We suspect, though, that maybe it's just that there's some difference in metabolism at an older age, maybe a difference in foraging and food intake that may cause that. But again, that's definitely study for a different day. And then I'll end on this. This is our more recent project that I've been working on with Kathy and Bo Song and Randeep. And I mentioned to you before that, and I'll just touch on this briefly. I hope that Randeep or somebody can give this talk a full hour to this talk. It's pretty interesting stuff. But I mentioned to you that we know that females lay their eggs in June, and we know the eggs hatch in late August, 9 weeks later. And we know the female comes back to the nest, give or take. We don't know anything about when she comes back, how long she's there, what she does when she's there, and what the factors are that influence her nest attendance. So that's what this study was kind of geared to do. and there's Randy on the job. So again, you've seen this photograph already, but the idea is, females tend to nest, but when do they come back? What do they do? And what are the factors that influence her nest attendance? And so we decided to consider certain factors like distance to water. So does the distance a nest is to the water influence the female's nest attendance? Or does the salinity of the water influence her attendance? Because up in inland 10 miles, no big deal. The water's all fresh there, but on the coast at Yawkey and down at Kiowati in Florida and Louisiana, along the coast, salt water is a big deal. And so females, alligators in general, can't tolerate salt water very long. And so if there's a flood or if there's a drought and the water concentrates salt, well, will the female leave those holes? And if so, how does that affect her nest attendance? And then things like distance to the nearest tree line, distance to the nearest road, that can influence the presence of predators because they have more cover. Does that influence the female's nest attendance? Things like the presence of a guard hole. So if there's no hole there, if there's just maybe a canal or a pond or a lake, how does that influence her attendance? And then finally, vegetative density. If nests are located in areas that are highly areas that are thick vegetation versus areas that are more open, how does that influence her attendance? And then I guess the last one was canopy cover. Nests that are most nests are in wide open marsh like this, but some nests are built under trees and things like that. And does that influence her nest attendance? Does, for example, having a nest in shade allow a female to attend the nest during hot periods of the day when otherwise the female couldn't do that in the marsh where it might be too hot for her, stuff like that. And so those are the site factors. And you think about things like environmental factors such as time of day. Does the female prefer to, or does the female come more often at night during the daytime to attend the nest, during periods of cooler weather, warmer weather, during periods of drought or during periods of rain, and during cloudy days versus sunny days, stuff like that. And so we went out, we found 25 nests that summer. This is summer of 2020, 25 nests, and we measured all those things. So we went to every nest and we measured distance to water and salinity, and we put temperature probes in the nest and outside the nest and looked at canopy cover and vegetative density, all these different things, and measured those at all these different nests. And then we put a game camera in every nest to monitor the female's presence through the entire incubation period. So we put those cameras up the day we found the nest. So there's the nest on the left. There's the female defending the nest in the foreground. There's a very nervous Randeep in the background, taking the camera out of the camera box. But anyway, we had these cameras set to take a photograph every minute for the entire incubation period, 9 weeks. That's 25 nests, a picture a minute for 9 weeks. A lot of photographs. So Randeep spent a lot of time going through photographs. He did a great job doing that. I think it took him several months, but he went through them all. And again, this is just basic results. We're still kind of working this out, but we think that of all the site factors that we looked at, really distance to water was the only one that really influenced the female's nest attendance. In other words, the farther away the nest was from water, the less likely the female was to attend it. Salinity, we think, might be important. In our study, it was a very weak effect, but I think we need to, we only measure salinity once every 2 weeks. And salinity could change daily based on rainfall patterns. So next time we're going to go in and try to put some salinity probes in the water that can measure salinity on a day-to-day basis. But the site factor, only one, distance to water. And then environmental factors, as you might guess, there were 3 that were important. Time of day, the females, as you might guess, preferred to, or they spend most of their time tending the nest during periods of total darkness when it's cooler, and also after periods of rainfall. We're not sure why that is. Perhaps has to do with temperature as well. And then this is my second to last slide, and I'll be done. But again, science is always surprises you, right? And so in putting these cameras up, we made an observation that had never been reported before in crocodilians, and this has really got us perplexed and excited. But we noticed at least at 4 different nests, we had situations where 2 different females tended the nest. So one of these females laid the eggs in this nest, but another female came and helped tend to. Usually it was when just one female at a time. So one female would disappear, another female would show up a little bit later. We have no idea what's going on there, if there's some kind of communal nest attendance, or if all females just are genetically wired if they see a nest to protect it or to crawl across it. But at 4 different nests, we had different females, at least 2 different females tending the nest, which is pretty interesting stuff. So again, you have these surprise observations that raise new questions. And so those are just a few of the projects we work on at Yawkey. We have a lot more. Again, Nest Associates, we're doing projects looking at what other animals use those nests for other purposes, basking, feeding, nesting. we're working with Charlie Rice at Clemson Biological Sciences, looking at exposure of alligators to a variety of environmental pathogens and how they respond immunologically to those. We're looking at exposure of alligators to microplastics, we're an emerging contaminant in the coastal zone of South Carolina and throughout the country, actually. Exposure, we found microplastics in the feces of alligators. We're trying to get an idea of exposure, how they're exposed and how that exposure might affect their biology. And then, of course, Angie Kidweaver, who many of you probably know, she's doing a great project on movement and space use of alligators in the coastal plain of South Carolina. And of course, Kathy's directing that with her. And a lot of us are involved in that, but it's a really amazing project. And it also closely relates to human-alligator interactions and alligator-human conflict. And so I won't steal her thunder, but she'll have an incredible amount of information to tell you about in the next year or so. And then the last two projects, well, I guess the second to last, the third to last, influence of climate change on alligator sex ratios, and then the influence of incubation temperature on housing survival. That's Samantha Bach. She's a PhD student at the University of Georgia, Savannah River Ecology Laboratory in Aiken. And she's the one that's been doing most of our temperature work and our incubation work. And then lastly, I'll just say this. I've given you kind of just an overview of what we do there. You've seen the resources, kind of what we're up to. We're totally open to collaborations by anybody. So if you've got ideas about ways to improve projects, new questions, please let us know, because we'd love to entertain that. So with that, I think we got about 10 minutes left. If you have any questions, I would love to answer those if I can. And thanks a lot again for tuning in. God, please tell me.
Hey, so I was curious, with your nest associations with the females, do you think that there's any possible room that it may have something to do with personality, or like the experience that comes with age after nesting for so long, when it comes to, you know, whether or not they're attending or what time they're attending, that sort of thing?
I definitely do. And again, that's just kind of speculation on my part, but I was trying to get the photos up here so I can see you again. I can't see you, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, so yes. So for example, we've seen, for example, females that the one I showed you, where Randy was at the nest and the female was kind of going toward him. So the females at Yawkey, a lot of them have been caught before, because we were out there all the time catching animals and doing things like that. And that capture makes the animals more wary of people. We've seen with the photographs where alligators, we'll go to a nest and check and change the camera or look for eggs, and there's no female to be seen. And then we'll leave, and then we'll check the camera the next week, and the camera will show us that right when we left, like a minute later, the female popped, she was there. So they're around, but they're afraid of us. But that female in the picture of Randy had not been caught before. She had no marks on her, so she was a new one to the study for us. So she had not experienced being caught before. Therefore, she was totally bold, and she had the attitude to defend her nest. So I think alligators, both from learning, you know, that the alligators have been caught before, know what it's like to be captured. They don't like it, and they kind of avoid people. But also, I think there's evidence that alligators do have individual personalities, and whether that's just, we have some females that actually have been caught before, and they still come after us. And so there are definitely personalities, I think, that make a difference.
Hey Thomas, it's Kathy. I was looking at the growth data that you were showing for some of those alligators, and I couldn't help but wonder. So it looks like not only did they stop growing, but maybe there was a little bit of evidence to suggest they might be shrinking in those last years, right? Do you think that's just measurement error, or do you think there's something going on there?
Great question. And so there's definitely measurement error. Frank Mazzotti's group down in Florida did a really cool study, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, where they actually went out and they actually caught animals and had different people measure them. And there was measurement error by, I think, 3.9% measurement error was what they found with total length, and I think 1.9% measurement error on snout to vent length. And we think ours is probably maybe even worse than that, just because we're measuring on some very uneven surfaces and stuff like that. I mean, we try to do the best we can to make it straight, but we know there's some measurement error. But at the same time, and so in our paper we published, we factored in measurement error with that, but also, oh man, I lost it. Oh yeah, as they get older, we think. I'm kind of making this up a little bit, but when people get older, they get a little bit, they hunch down a little bit. They seem not as tall as they used to be, right? And so alligators, like Bertha, for example, her last 2 measurements, she was shorter than she was in her prime, so to speak. So that might actually be a true measurement. It may be she's just a little bit. I know her tail was a little bit, wasn't quite as thick. Her body condition seemed a little bit decreased, and so it's probably a little of both. But I know there's measurement error for sure.
Great, thank you.
I have a quick question. Hi, Thomas.
Hey, Mary.
I'm curious, when thinking about, temperature determining the sex of the offspring, is there a correlation between like nest quality, maybe like better nests are warmer or something, and the sex they produce? And then if that's true, do older females tend to have like the same, like do they produce the same sex every year, or is it mixed?
That's a really great question, and the answer is we don't know, because no one really, I mean, other than us that I know of, really go out and trap females out the nest and can actually tell you who the female was that lays these same eggs. So, and the general pattern of sex determination is that if you have a nest that where the incubation temperature, so the eggs incubate for 9 weeks. And we do know that the middle third of the incubation is when sex is determined. It's called the thermosensitive period. And that's the middle 3 weeks of incubation. And that's during developmental stages 21 to 24, which doesn't really matter to anybody here, but that's when all that happens. We still don't really know how it works, but we know it happens in that window. Actually, a few years ago, we actually determined it was actually stage 15 to 24, but that's a different story. But if you have a mean temperature in the nest that's 33 degrees or 33.5 degrees centigrade, you're going to get almost all males. And then anything slightly above that or below that, you're going to get mostly females. What often happens is you have a fluctuation of temperatures in the nest during the incubation period, where you often get a mixture of sexes. But you're right. I mean, there's people speculate, including us, that a nest, for example, that's in the marsh with no shade at all. It's just total sunlight beating down on all day, all summer long, versus a nest that may be laid under a pine tree on the edge of the swamp, and it's getting shade a lot. You have different temperatures in there, and you may get different sex ratios. And in fact, one of the things Samantha's done, she published this paper a few years ago, where she took, we have a thermistor in the nest that measures the incubation temperature of the eggs, and we determine the sex rate. We've done that for years, so we kind of know what temperatures produce what sexes. And then we have an ambient temperature logger outside the nest to log ambient temperature, so we can actually determine a relationship between ambient temperature and nest temperature. And then she goes in and looks at all these NOAA climate models and looks at, okay, what's the temperature going to be at Yawkey, in 50 years and 100 years and 200 years, and you can kind of predict. Again, it's, a lot of modeling and predictions about what sex ratios might be in 50 years, 100 years, and 200 years from now. And she predicted, or the models predicted, that in 200 years that the sex ratios will be male biased at Yawkey, our study site, if things work out the way they're supposed to. But again, it's very difficult to determine true sex ratios of animals in the field, because you have to let them hatch in the field. You take them out of the nest, they're gonna, you're manipulating the true system. But if you let them hatch in the field, then you have to be there when they hatch to collect the babies and then let them grow for about a month or two to determine sex. So it's not been done very often.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Thomas, there was a question, I was just looking in the chat from Mike, who asked, how many stump-tail individuals have you seen?
How many stump-tail? So at Yawkey, a lot. So that's a great question, because Yawkey is an island, and there's very little fresh water at Yawkey. Like I mentioned, if you study alligators at Lake Marion or Lake Moultrie, we've done a little bit of that. Don't often see many animals with injuries because there's so much fresh water they can spread out. At Yawkey, there's just like 2 freshwater bodies on the entire property. The rest of it is either brackish or it's full strength seawater or marsh. And so the alligators, we've noticed they tend to feed in the marsh. They go out and feed in the marsh, but they come back. and they pile into these canals and these freshwater areas, and they're on top of each other. There's a lot of interaction. So I would say, oh man, maybe half or more of the animals that we capture are either missing limbs or missing part of their tail. There's a lot of aggressive interactions going on between the alligators, but they tend to survive it pretty well. I mean, the injuries that alligators sustain from just interacting with each other, human beings wouldn't last very long, but alligators seem to do just fine. We have a lot of animals that have misaligned jaws and missing tails and missing limbs, and they survive just fine.
Great. Any other questions for Thomas? Okay. Thomas, thank you again so much. That was super interesting. I've been out with you several times and I still am really excited to kind of